There's been a certain virus recently that has given microbes in general a bad name, I think, because they can cause a lot of pain and suffering and disease. And we're going to end up talking about coronavirus and COVID quite a bit this quarter, but what I wanted to do here was talk about kind of the other end of the spectrum. So it turns out that most microbes, and most bacteria and viruses and parasites either have no ill effects on us or they do something beneficial for us. And so that's the purpose of this video, is to talk about some examples of those things. So to set this up, I'm going to share this term. It's called the microbiome, and the microbiome is basically the collection of microbes that you find normally living in or on the human body. And so one of the hot areas of microbiology research lately has been studying how specific bacterial species that make up the microbiome, what specific benefits do those have for us? And so one example of a benefit that these microbes might be giving us is this. So there's been some recent evidence to suggest that microbes living in the gut have an effect, have an influence on how the brain functions and how the brain develops. And so at first this might seem like not really intuitive, because the gut and the brain are just physically pretty far apart from one another. So you might not expect there to be a connection between what the microbes in the gut are doing and what the brain is doing. But again, recent evidence seems to suggest that there is at least a correlation. For example, there was some work written up in this article not too long ago. The article is called How Microbiomes Affect Fear, that suggests that there might be a connection between what's going on with the microbes in the gut and what's happening with the brain. So what the researchers described in this article did was that they looked at 3 groups of mice, and what made the 3 groups different was the amount of bacteria they had living in their gut. So one of the groups of mice had a normal collection, a normal array of bacteria that lived in their guts. Another group of mice had some bacteria living in their gut, but not quite as many as the first group. And then the last group of mice had the bacteria in their gut completely demolished, completely obliterated, so that basically they had a sterile environment in their gut, no bacteria at all. And basically what they did with all 3 groups of mice was that they conditioned them to fear a sound. And the way they did that was by playing a chime and by immediately following up that chime with an electrical shock. And so they did this over and over again for a while. Chime followed by bzz, bzz, a shock. Chime followed by bzz, bzz, a shock. And then over time, the mice were conditioned to just be afraid of the sound. And so this was the case for all 3 groups of mice, right? All 3 groups basically learned to be all equally afraid of that sound. So then next, what the researchers wanted to find out is whether they could cause the mice to unlearn to be afraid of the sound. So the way they did that is that they took all 3 groups of mice, which were now afraid of the sound, and they played that same sound repeatedly, but this time they would not follow that up with an electrical shock. And so what they found was that the group of mice who had a normal, healthy collection of bacteria living in their gut, they became desensitized. So they were able to unlearn how to be afraid of that sound again. But they found that that was not the case for the group of mice that did not have that full array of bacteria living in their gut. So with these 2 groups of mice, no matter how long they tried to do this unlearning process, it didn't work, it didn't help. So they remained afraid of that sound. And so again, this seems to suggest that there's a correlation between having a normal array of bacteria living in the gut and some function of the brain. What these researchers did next was that they looked at a specific part of the brains of these mice. And so what they looked at specifically was the prefrontal cortex of the brains of these mice. And the reason why they looked at the prefrontal cortex is because this is the part of the brain where fear is regulated, or where fear is processed. And what they noticed was that there was a difference between the prefrontal cortex of these mice and the prefrontal cortexes, or cortices, cortexes of these mice. And specifically what they found was that there were cells in the prefrontal cortexes of these mice that either were underdeveloped or were not functioning as fully as the corresponding cells in the prefrontal cortex of the brains of these mice. And so again, this seems to suggest that there is a correlation between what the bacteria in the guts of these mice are doing and how the cells in the brain are functioning. So next, what these researchers wanted to do was maybe figure out exactly how that communication is happening. So how exactly is the activity of these bacteria influencing what's happening up in the brain? And so one structure that's long been suspected of allowing for that communication between bacteria and the gut. And what's happening in the brain is the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve is a pretty long nerve that runs from those two places in the body, the gut to the brain. And in this experiment, to test out whether this was serving as kind of the conduit through which those messages could travel, what they did was that they cut this vagus nerve in the mice that had a normal array of bacteria in their gut. So if this vagus nerve was indeed the way in which the bacteria in the gut were communicating with the cells in the brain, then what you would expect after the researchers cut this nerve is that these mice then would basically be relegated to acting like these mice. So in other words, after cutting that vagus nerve, if that vagus nerve is what is allowing for the communication between the gut and the brain, then these mice would not be able to unlearn to be afraid of that sound, just like these mice in these groups. But it turns out that that was not the case. So in these mice, even after cutting their vagus nerve, they were still able to unlearn how to become afraid of that sound. So whatever these bacteria are doing to influence normal cell development in the prefrontal cortex, it looks like it's not happening by way of this vagus nerve. So then what are the ways that these bacteria possibly are communicating with the brains of these mice? Well, it turns out that if you consider what's going on in the bodies of these mice compared to what's going on in the bodies of these mice, there are certain metabolic compounds that the bacteria produce that are missing in the blood, the cerebrospinal fluid, and in the stool of these mice. Those same metabolic compounds are present in the mice in this group. So perhaps if these bacteria are producing any kind of chemicals or any type of signaling molecule that affects what's happening in the brain, perhaps it's through one of these fluids right here. Except probably not the stool, because that would be really weird to have the poop influencing what's happening up in the brain. But perhaps, who knows? So again, microbes in general lately have been getting a bad rap because they can cause disease and a lot of suffering, but overwhelmingly most of the microbes out there do nothing to us, and in a lot of cases they have some benefit for us. And there can be some practical applications for this. So for example, if we ever get around to a point where we can say for sure that the microbes living in the gut have an effect, and we know exactly what effect that is on the processing of fear in the brain, then we might be able to use that knowledge to help out with things like post-traumatic stress syndrome. So basically folks with PTSD have learned to be afraid of a certain thing and are having a tough time unlearning that particular fear. And so if we know for sure that microbes play a role in that unlearning process, then perhaps those microbes could be used to help treat PTSD.